heating up in the news right now is the debate over rising service charges for residents promised so-called affordable housing. Reports suggest rates have soared as high as £8,000 a year. Lawyer Denise Nurse explains how to handle unfair fees, and fears, I guess, both work there. First, hi Denise, what is going on with this, please?
I know, it's horrible sounding, isn't it? It's quite shocking. As you say, some residents living in what's supposed to be affordable housing, so it's particularly shared ownership homes, they're having some real issue with these rising costs of the service charge. And as you said, some are paying an additional £8,000 on top of their mortgage and their rent.
Yeah, that's huge.
It's extortionate, isn't it? It's quite a lot. So focusing just on the shared housing model, because this is a particular one that's having this issue, that's meant to be affordable because it's giving someone like a step onto the housing ladder, getting them going so they can take part of ownership and pay a mortgage and then get a subsidised rent. So the whole point is to make it palatable, you can budget, you can know what you're doing. However, what's happening is they're buying, they're getting onto the housing ladder, and then the service charge is soaring, and sometimes up to 400% after the residents have moved in. So it's a really big jump, and imagine paying that alongside your mortgage and your rent. Yeah. So it's becoming unaffordable, quite frankly, really. So what you think of as affordable housing suddenly becomes outside of your budget and can be quite stressful, you know, and feel out of control, make it quite difficult for you. So this is what's happening, and that's why we're getting those headlines. And the effect isn't just, I suppose, emotional and stressful. It's actually having real-world effects. So you've got to pay more, then you're finding that you can't maybe sell the property because who wants to buy an affordable home with this extortionate charge? And it's leaving people feeling trapped, which I think is just a travesty. It's really quite difficult and challenging. So people are trying to take action. Some people living in these houses and facing these rising charges are banding together or individually planning legal action against housing associations, local authorities and government, because they want to stop these rises, you know, make it more manageable, make it something they can deal with and figure out why is something that should be affordable becoming unaffordable. There is some data that says that there's 4.1 million of us living in these rented or part rented homes. So it's an issue that needs tackling. There are campaigners out there, an organisation called the Social Housing Action Campaign. So they're calling on government to do a few things: freeze unfair rent or uncapped service charges. So just do something to make it so we have some clarity on what's happening and put an end to service charge abuse. So they are trying to do things like that. They're also asking for regulation to prevent these huge increases once the sale is concluded. So that feeling of being trapped where you think, I've sold this and then I've got into the flat and now the price has gone up. So they're trying to do that. And there's some more research that I think really does back this up. And it's important to say that when people take action, and we'll talk about how you do that, you go to something called the first tier tribunal in many cases. And it's been seen over the last year or so in some reports that 70% of their cases are finding that there has been overcharging. So that indicates to me that there is a problem that needs to be tackled.
So what are the government saying about this then?
Well, the government has said in relation to this, we asked the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government about it, and it told us that far too many leaseholders and social housing tenants across the country are being asked to pay unreasonable and extortionate charges. And it added that this year it will consult on plans for more transparency of service charges and holding landlords to account for the money they spend.
So, generally speaking, when it comes to service charges, exactly what are they and how do they work?
So a service charge is something that you're likely to find when you're a tenant because it's different however you're a leaseholder. So whether you're in social housing, affordable housing, a private tenant, rent to buy, shared ownership, any of those things, you're likely to have a service charge. What it covers is the cost of, say, the communal parts of your property. So you've got your own flat or dwelling, but any shared parts.
So the stairs, the
landstairs, exactly, the lift, the elevator, gardens, areas like that, your insurance and any other maintenance that the landlord might have to do. you'll find the information in your tenancy agreement or your lease. So that's where everything should be set out, and only the things that are in there should be charged, but they can be charged. And so there'll be a service charge that you have to pay. So all of those things should be included, but of course the cost can vary because it will depend what happens, what goes wrong in any particular year. Sometimes you're charged in advance, and sometimes you're charged after the event. And again, it all comes down to what's in your lease to figure out.
What rights do people actually have with these service charges? Can they refuse to pay them if they don't have the money?
Yeah, unfortunately, in most circumstances, you really should err on the side of paying. There's only limited circumstances when you can legitimately withhold payment. So without breaching the terms of your lease, and you don't want to do that. I mean, this is the safety and security of you and your family and your home. So if the landlord has issued you a service charge demand, you can withhold them if they've not included you can withhold the payment if you've not included a summary of your rights. It should be in there, and obligations, and if their name and address isn't on the demand. So if they haven't given you the demand in the first place to say this is what it is, they've just given you a charge. But if they then haven't given a summary of your rights and obligations, and if they haven't put their name and address, you could then legitimately withhold, but only if they don't make corrections. So if you say to them, hey, you haven't done this, and then they correct it, you should pay. The thing is, you don't want to be at risk of having a court claim against you. You want to err on the side of negotiating with the landlord once they've given you the notice. So that's really the only circumstance I'd say.
So for people watching now who are in this position, what tips have you got for disputing service charge costs?
Well, before we get to that, I just want to go through the full breakdown of those rights.
Okay.
So that we can know what we're disputing.
Right, yeah.
So the service charge, the right, you have a right to get information. So what I've said to you is that notice has to be given to you. So in that, it's got to be information about the service charge, how it's going to be spent, and it should be everything that's in your lease. So it should be a summary of the costs. That's what's called a Section 21 landlord from the Landlord and Tenant Act of 1985. So you should ask to see receipts and the accounts. And once you get that summary, you have up to you've got within 12 months before you can request it. So you must make a request for that summary in writing, and you have a time limit of 6 months from receiving the summary to ask for that information. If the landlord does not give you that information, it's a criminal offence. That's quite important. Now, increases should be reasonable, and you need to be notified in advance of any increase. So these are all the rights that you have. If you want to dispute it and any of those rights not being given, first thing first, check your lease or tenancy agreement. So what they've said in that notice, is it what was in the lease and tenancy agreement? Is it covering something that they've said they're going to be maintaining? Keep records of the increases and how they've been communicated to you, what works they've actually done. A lot of people find that they're disputing that the work wasn't done. So you want to make sure you've got a record of that. Ask for clarification and justification. Look for a tenancy group if you need some support when you're doing this. And when you are paying, so I said don't withhold, but pay under protest. And there are template letters out there to show you how to do it. And then only if that doesn't work, shall I say, escalate. You can go to what's called the first tier tribunal that we talked about. And if you really need some help, I go to the Leasehold Advisory Service. It's a great place for a breakdown of all of this information because it's quite complex.
Right. Yeah, it can be quite overwhelming, can't it? I'm excited.